Thanks very much, Jenna. That was great. And I quite like the ongoing attention to Detroit as a case, and would just, I would underscore Liz Cohen's points about the relative symmetry of these cases. I mean, I think among the opportunities that this event offers us is the opportunity to examine cases, the relationships between the life of the city and its spatial or formal construction, which aren't necessarily always the same cases that we return to perennially. And in that regard, certainly Detroit and Toronto afford a nice symmetry. Their geographic proximity, historic formation, economic base, and radical asymmetry of development over the last several decades. This also gives me, in the informality of this colloquium, the opportunity to do something new. And so what I have for you are some brief notes, a kind of sketch, a way of questioning or a way of approaching the city of Toronto. And in part, trying to understand the experience of Toronto as lived in the way that it relates to Toronto as a set of built or constructed environments. In that regard, I'll be looking at the way in which Toronto has been both the subject and the object of film over the last couple of years. And in that way, try to provide a provisional schema about how we might think about aspects of urbanization or forms of urbanization relative to their representation or the representation of the life of the city in its social context. It happens to be true that Toronto is growing rapidly. About 100,000 new immigrants each year move to the city, 1 million each decade. And that, combined with a fairly prosperous economy, as well as a fairly intact welfare state, produces a kind of anomaly in the North American condition. It's also true that Toronto has historically enjoyed a fairly high degree of discourse, or if not tension, between the projects of modernization through architectural and urban work, and resistance to those projects, both from those within and without of the academy. In that regard, I've been mindful of a distinction that was first brought to my attention by our colleague here, Rodolfo Machado. 7.5 years ago, I was moving from Chicago to Toronto to join the faculty at the University of Toronto, and Rodolfo made this distinction between the two cities that has persisted in my mind, that he described Chicago as a city that offered itself up in pure visibility and kind of pure exteriority. Chicago is a city that's experienced at high speed and by the highway. And he contrasted that with Toronto, a city that he really understood to be one of fabric, interiority. It really rarely makes itself available visually in the same way, and certainly not at speed. And so that contrast has informed my thoughts here today. In that regard, I wonder if there might be a way for us to map that question of exteriority and visibility versus the interiority and resistance of fabric relative to the ways in which the film industry has developed in Toronto and the kinds of images of Toronto that have been constructed through that film industry. In certain ways, what I've got to say very briefly might resonate a little bit with what Antoine Picon had to say yesterday in his first paper. Picon was talking about the Pompidou freeway in the center of Paris, and the contrast between the banks of the Seine given over to automobility and industry, presumably in the logic of production, and its contemporary alternative, which is the closing of the highway in lieu of things like Paris Plage and destination entertainment and recreation, tourism and the like. And in that contrast, I think you may hear certain resonances of that in what I've got to say today. Toronto is Canada's most populous city, about 5 million people metro area, just over half of whom live in the central area of the city limits itself. It is both the most diverse multicultural city by various UN measures in the world in terms of languages spoken, religions followed, etc. Half the population of the city of Toronto were born outside the country. And that, in addition to the visibility of various ethnic and racial populations, produces an extraordinary multicultural form for the city. Toronto, I occasionally ruffle the feathers of my Quebecois friends when I remind them that Toronto in the last couple of decades has replaced Montreal as the country's most important cultural production center. You may hear some debate around that around the edges, but in part after Quebecois separatists overreached and engaged in political violence, much of the production engine, let's say, around culture moved from Montreal into Toronto. And it's certainly fair to say that for those of you who think of Montreal as kind of cultural heart of Canada, it is true that an overwhelming percentage of Montreal is continuing to be engaged in cultural production, but Toronto has, in my view at least over the last several decades, consolidated its position as the place where people in the visual and literary arts come from. And of course you also remember that Canada and Toronto specifically are overrepresented in North American cultural production, particularly in the visual arts and literary arts, and the export of Canadian talking heads into the US industries I think has been quite well reported. A part of this has of course to do with Toronto's decision to support the film industry. A part of this having to do with a series of strategic, both federal and provincial decisions to provide tax incentives, to manage the exchange rate so as to lure the production, the industrial side of filmmaking to Canada. It also has to do with the relatively skilled labor pool in English-speaking Canada. It also has to do with the history of visual production through its art college training and other things. The cultural life of photography and other visual forms in Toronto I won't spend a lot of time on, but also I think is quite significant in that regard. And so by way of an opening, what I would ask is that we know that Toronto has emerged as an industrial backlot for much of Hollywood, especially the kind of B movies out of Hollywood. And then in that regard, Toronto has been called upon to stand in as a surrogate for a range of US cities. It's also been equally true that in the recent past, Toronto has developed its own autochthonous, organic, independent film culture. And what I'm proposing by way of a question is, would it be useful to read that film production vis-a-vis that history of fabric and resistance to projects of modernization? And so I don't have any conclusions to draw for you this afternoon, but I do want to provide that as a kind of frame. And in order to set the stage, I'll start with one of those independent films that have been made in Toronto in the recent past. This is the work of, sorry about that. This is the work of filmmaker Ed Gasdonnelly and Sukyin Lee and David Sutherland. It's called Toronto Stories from 2008. Toronto Stories involves 4 directors and 4 narratives about immigrants into Toronto. And using this African boy and his immigrant experience juxtaposes that against the kind of fabric of portions of downtown Toronto.
I always imagined that one day I would see a woman and fall instantly in love with her.
Some of the clips are a little bit dark. I apologize for that, but we'll try to bring the lights down. And so it's in part because of the fact that Toronto developed the industry of filmmaking and has in place the both human capital but also the spatial configuration to support very large-scale Hollywood-style production films, that Toronto's own independent film production scenario is possible. But what I want to juxtapose is that fabric of Toronto, its kind of immigrant experience as evidenced in Toronto Stories and other films like it, with projects of modernization over the course of the post-war years. And so I thought I would start here with a relatively obscure Buckminster Fuller proposal for Project Toronto. This was a very large public university that was meant to be adjacent to the Central Business District and house the research and student life of a new university in Ontario. You can see at the top of the slide, sorry about that, you can see at the top of the slide the Toronto City Hall, which by the time of Fuller's proposal in '68 was already extant and represented one project of modernization writ large. You can see here in the model from the mid-'60s, Toronto City Hall at the base as a part of an overall project of modernizing both the civic core but also the commercial district in downtown Toronto. About 5 years ago, a Hollywood B-list movie, in this case zombie film, called Resident Evil Apocalypse, used Toronto and the Toronto City Hall as its backdrop. And of course, the demolition of the civic figure of the city of Toronto. In Resident Evil, of course, Toronto wasn't Toronto. Toronto was standing in for a kind of generalized post-apocalyptic metropolitan condition. It was referred to with a wink at the audience as Raccoon City, referencing Toronto's infamous raccoon problems. But for those that were kind of in the circle of Toronto cultural production, of course, the destruction of City Hall was seen in a historical resonance with the work of Jane Jacobs in resisting projects of modernization. In this case here, the tale, of course, would be the 1971 victory of the annex dwellers against the so-called Spadina Expressway. The Spadina Expressway had been a part of post-war planning in Toronto from as early as 1949, and had in fact gone through planning in the 60s and was well under construction by the time in the late 1960s and early 1970s that it became a kind of rallying point for those annex dwellers who wanted to resist such projects of modernization. And you can see here the headline from the newspaper, the Globe and Mail, Canada's paper of record, you can imagine, from June 4th, 1971, quoting the Premier of Ontario, Bill Davis, who canceled the project, saying, quote, if we're building a transportation system to serve the automobile, the Spadina Expressway would be a good place to start. But if we are building a transportation system to serve people, the Spadina Expressway is a very good place to stop. And in that regard, of course, he signaled what's now come to be one of the defining narratives of Toronto urbanism, if not North American discourse on cities, which is, are we building cities for automobiles or for people? And of course, Picon yesterday referenced the recent project of recuperating Robert Moses, or the debate between Moses and Jacobs, and of course, the fact that Jacobs moved to Toronto in part in response to the Vietnam era political context, and the draft in the US is not unrelated here. What I'm interested in here is not so much the Jacobs mythology, which is available and has been done much better than I could do it by others. I'm interested here in the way in which a very particular Toronto school of architecture and urbanism responded in the wake of the Jacobs success. That is, between 1973 and 1978-79, a set of architectural and urban projects were manifest coming out of the euphoria of the Jacobs success. The political left was emboldened, and both at the provincial and city level, political leadership united with cultural producers, and architecture and urbanism was seen as a set of key media. And of course, I'm referencing here the work of George Baird. He and Charles Jenks editing in 1969 Meaning in Architecture. And following that work, Baird brought his interest in European rationalism to Toronto in the early 70s. This is a later publication of AD showing George Baird, Rem Koolhaas enjoying oysters with boxing gloves on, as a reference to the idea of a kind of European rationalism. In 73 and 74, George Baird collaborated with a group of people in Toronto to publish two important publications that would give voice to this idea of a kind of architectural form for the lives of Torontonians, which would be resistant to the broader projects of modernization, or at least in a kind of dialectic with, maybe would be a better way to put it. And so on Building Downtown, developed a series of building strategies that you might think of as high density, low rise, in the fabric of the existing territory of downtown Toronto. The second publication from 1975, Built Form Analysis, was an empirically based kind of examination of the forms that had worked in Toronto over time relative to its existing fabric. And while not exactly arguing for resistance, it argued for densification within the existing lot structure of what was already a fairly dense city. At the same moment, in 74, 75, a range of projects began coming out of offices associated with the Baird School. In this case, I'm showing you Jack Diamond, Barton Myers, 1975, Sherborne Housing. And in this regard, I want to reference the support I've had by my colleague and friend Adrian Blackwell at the University of Toronto, who got me a couple of these images over the last couple of days from the libraries at the U of T. Most importantly in this genealogy would be the 1978 project for Hydroblock, again, Diamond and Myers. In this case, taking the density of what would have been a tower in the context of a kind of social housing, partly subsidized, and developing a very, very low rise but high density, a very, very complex typology in the genre of European rationalism. This culminates in the development of the St. Lawrence neighborhood in Toronto, which is a kind of alignment of both federal, provincial, but equally kind of civic leadership politically with architectural and urban strategies for a portion of the city's downtown. And again, so Bayard and Jacobs as kind of compatriots trying to accommodate growth, accommodate density, but also to resist some of the deleterious effects of modernization, especially automobility. In that regard, for our story this afternoon, it would be worth noting that the most recent regime of urbanization in the context of Toronto over the course of the last decade or so has not been unrelated. That is, Jane Jacobs and a range of other cultural producers had a hand in first encouraging to run and then in securing the nomination for and then finally the election twice of the city's most recent mayor, David Miller. He's shown here on the left with Jane Jacobs in 2003, and then there on the right in 2004 with Margaret Atwood. And it was among the highlights of my career to date that in my first week at the University of Toronto, I was invited to join the dais on a panel with Margaret and with Jane Jacobs. And they're extraordinary in terms of the way that they embody a particular way of kind of lived cultural experience in Toronto. And of course, by referencing Margaret Atwood, we could also reference Adam Agoy and a whole range of other cultural producers coming out of Toronto. But what I want to suggest is that the most recent projects of urbanization in the city of Toronto, and I'm referencing here the Adrian Heu's West 8 project for the Central Waterfront or other projects like it, come out of a genealogy from progressive era politics, annex dwellers, Jane Jacobs specifically, and others in a political program to try to continue to manifest a public realm. But in this case, it's a public realm in which it's not so much built form and density, but rather landscape that provides this medium of urbanization. In that regard, of course, Michael van Valkenburg's winning project with Ken Greenberg for the Lower Don lands would also be relevant. It's not uninteresting in my mind that the project for the Lower Don is in fact pushing against the ongoing industrial use of the Lower Don. If you can make out here, just on the right side of this slide, it says film port. And in fact, one of the ongoing industrial uses for this territory is in the film industry. And this Lower Don territory, its industrial use being a fairly large tracts of land available for the kinds of very, very large span spaces for soundstage construction. So we have a kind of tension on the one hand between Toronto as envisioned by David Miller and Adrian Heu's and others, proposing Toronto to be about communities but in which ecological services are remediated, versus Toronto as an ongoing industrial concern, its industry being, among other things, film. That film production scenario is one which is an enormously vital part of the city's economy. And I just like this little clip that I found. It's a filmmaker, director of photography or cinematographer, going out to the site of their work for the day and just taking a YouTube video through the rearview mirror, leaving those sound stages with their rental trucks. And for those of you that have spent time in Toronto or lived there, you know that this kind of an experience, that is seeing a film set or crew on site, is an everyday, multiple times a day occurrence, and more so than any other city I've seen. Portions of the city are shut down or rented off on a regular basis to be given over to the industrial production of the film industry. In that regard, I suppose the idea of the tension between ongoing industrial productivity on the one hand and the kinds of spatiality that productivity takes, as opposed to an image of Toronto as a city of neighborhoods and fabric in which we inhabit the interior or the small stories of the kind of block structure of Toronto, is a part of what I'm trying to get at here. Now, of course, in Toronto's development as a film venue, it's been most often called upon to stand in, as I said, as a surrogate for other places that it's not. And that's really, I think, one of the primary origins of the film industry in Toronto. It stood in very serviceably, I thought, for Cambridge itself and MIT, with the University of Toronto playing MIT spaces in Good Will Hunting. And of course, even beyond the Van Zandt film, which I thought was of some quality, it's the kind of B-list Hollywood stuff that we most often associate with Toronto being called in to stand in for New York or Chicago or Los Angeles even. And in fact, it's that status as a kind of surrogate, which I think produces for Canadians or Torontonians a kind of insecurity or a kind of ambivalence about, well, how is it that this industry is coming in and basically using our spaces so as to project images of urbanity that are so generic. Over the course of the last decades, Toronto's film industry has become so robust and so well-serviced and tax incentivized that it has become the definitive preferred venue for a whole range of visual forms. And I was very happy to see that Jana included a reference to an automobile commercial, because I, in fact, have one. And it's not all uncommon that Toronto has become the most often used venue for automobile commercials in North America. And they're carefully edited so as to produce an image of a kind of generic destination cosmopolitan life, the heightened sense of consumption, and at the same moment it's a city that's been essentially kind of cleaned, scrutinized and stripped of any of its Canadian or certainly Torontonian specificity. That business of scrubbing the neighborhoods, of coming through and taking through all the English language spelling signs or all of the strange, odd British legacy Canadian street signs down so as to allow the place to look like some other place, specifically like New York or Chicago or LA, or even less specifically to look like a generic place, is a part of the life of the city. More specifically, you can also see examples like this. This is an Audi kind of guerrilla advertising campaign where the actual object of the car is a kind of fetish object in miniature, is attached through magnets to the surfaces of the city in and around the Toronto International Film Festival. And the film festival also has become, of course, a kind of focus of these conversations and questions. And I'm showing you here the recently completed Bell Lightbox building by Bruce Kuwabara, him himself, of course, George Baird's student and former colleague. And so Toronto is right now producing venues like this so as to be venues for spectacle, not simply the production of film or the backlot or backdrop for film, but places in which the staging of film and its reception might be theatricalized. The Toronto Film Festival is now widely regarded by most people in English language cinema as the second most important in the season after the Cannes Film Festival. And again, I won't make any judgment value about those claims, but I'll simply report them. But it is true that a part of Toronto's future, both civically and economically, is hinging on the idea of it producing a kind of destination scenario or thematic environment, in this case around the film festival, you can see, which will both lure producers, cultural producers, but also additional economic potential. In that regard, I'm increasingly aware of at least three kinds of film being produced in and around Toronto. And I wonder, again, going forward, if it might not be possible to do something at greater length in the future with that schema of three kinds of film representing three kinds of space in Toronto. I've already referenced the idea of Toronto as a kind of surrogate, which tends to use aspects, highly edited fragments of Toronto's built environment to stand in for other cities elsewhere in time and space. I've also already mentioned the idea of Toronto as a kind of generic destination lifestyle venue. That's also, of course, a part of it. But increasingly, I'm impressed, and critics who actually know this material are impressed by the quality of the independent film scene coming out of Toronto. And I thought I would just close briefly with one example of that. In my own mind, disproportionately, these independent films tend to tell what we might think of as minor stories or small stories. They also tend to focus on the lives of actual people and their kind of daily social milieu, and also disproportionately in the neighborhoods. And as a result, these films more often than not give one a sense of Toronto as lived, or at least as I've experienced at various moments. And so by way of an example from last year, 2010, I thought I would close with This Movie Is Broken, one of the several award-winning Toronto-produced independent films in the recent past. More often than not, these stories begin with very, very small stories in the lives of their protagonists. But that narrative or plot is set against Toronto as a kind of other figure, another actor, another protagonist in the film. More often than not, these films also have a kind of space within them because they don't engage in the broader kind of plot devices or narrative constructions of most Hollywood cliches, in which simply the life and space and breadth of Toronto can be found evident. In this regard, this movie is broken is a kind of mashup as a genre. It's of course a love story. You've already seen that. It's also a bit of a concert film featuring one of Toronto's locally produced bands, the Broken Social Scene. And then in the combination of those two things, it uses the political and cultural context of the garbage strike of 2009 as its backdrop. And in that regard, many of these films find a kind of space for what would otherwise be understood as directly political or at least social commentary.
During the municipal workers' strike, the site is now full, and despite opposition from local residents, the city of Toronto has obtained an injunction to spray garbage at the park with pesticides. The city had to go to...
So that image in closing of the city of Toronto's wonderful parks filled with its own waste products reminds me very vividly of June 2009 as we were packing to move here. My colleagues and friends who were dutiful composters in Toronto filled their their freezer that summer with frozen compost goods, in part because of a kind of labor relationship between the garbage workers and the administration of David Miller that finally broke down. Over this issue, Miller was voted out of office most recently to a mayor who represents North York, among other things. And this oscillation in Toronto post-amalgamation between a mayor representing the outer boroughs, let's say, and those representing the annex, as did Miller, is, I think, one of the ongoing dynamics that I'm interested to follow, given, in fact, that David Miller had been one of the strong supporters of many of the landscape projects on the waterfront in Toronto. The future of those projects going forward is very much in doubt now in the wake of this political failing, and the idea that the image of our waste itself clogging up the space of the city was something that this little modest independent film was able to put forward in a way and record with a level of authenticity and organic quality that I found quite compelling. Thanks very much.